similar thing. They their cloth, the way they clothe, the way they wear clothes is a little bit less conservative than the way the Iraqi Christians are used to. So when they come here, they are assimilating to that. But are they actually acculturating? Meaning, is their mentality psychologically, are they becoming a part of the society? Do they think the same? That's when the actually acculturation happens. And adaptation doesn't mean doing the adaptation doesn't actually is also a part of acculturation, but the difference between adaptation and assimilation is doing similar things rather than adaptation means doing accepting the change that they see but actually not doing the same, so that's adapting to it, meaning accepting it rather than them doing it. So, and the point you raised about racism, it actually did have an effect on the early comers, because I have mentioned in my research that their experience was not, and even growing up when I was in Iraq, we could hear that, well, our Christians are in Detroit, but Detroit is a very dangerous place to go to, and that's because now coming across these people who actually talk to me about how they suffered, because the early comers didn't come with their families, they came alone. Let's say the man came alone and found a job, and the man, in order to accumulate money or gather a little bit of fortune, he was ready to even sleep in a store. When he was working in a store as a worker, he was ready to even sleep in that store. So that was at the stage of a struggle for the very early comers. And they have faced a lot of discrimination, because not with the, I don't want to be racist or mention something wrong, but with the, let's say, European Americans, but more with the African Americans. There were a lot of incidents of them being killed. That's because they were thinking that the appearances of the Middle Easterners or the Iraqi Christians is a little fairer than, let's say, the African Americans. So they felt that they still look down at them, and they associate themselves with the white Americans, which is also some kind of discrimination. So they were actually killed. A lot of incidents of death happened. So this was the cause that they had to, even those who had started their businesses in downtown Detroit, to move to the suburbs. Now where I visited is a suburb. Sterling Heights is a suburb, rather than the actual big business in downtown Detroit.
Well, I think what kind of follows from that is, to some extent, part of that process of acculturation, assimilation, is learning about white supremacy and how that's very much ingrained in the American fabric, and then kind of passing that on, right? So to some extent, then sort of learning how that racism works, and then kind of taking advantage to some extent of that too, in terms of, you know, the relationship between African Americans and these immigrants, right?
Yeah, but there's also another thing, and this is also adding to how this racism is changing and how all the community together is changing. Because in the past, there was conflict between these two groups, and they were, let's say, hating each other. And then when there was an incident that I also have mentioned, when one daughter was pregnant with an African American, her family wanted to kill her, but they didn't kill her, but she ended up living alone and raising her kid alone. But nowadays, it's a very, very normal thing to actually get married to an African American and start a family with African American. So this is changing over time, and people are actually assimilating. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
About what do you think? What was so-called American? Because in your writing, you keep mentioning being American, but how do you define American?
Yeah.
American from say that more especially? Can you say more especially?
Okay, so Americanness is not something new, but and what I wanted to, I don't know if I was clear in my introduction about Americanness. It is actually the values, the American values, meaning freedom of religion and working for gaining. It means if you work hard, you gain as much as you want, and it's a country of freedom. Everybody is free to express whatever he wants, and also it's the country of laws and regulations that everybody has to follow. These are the values, but we don't have that back in Iraq. People are not free. People, even if they work hard, they can never reach if they don't have enough connections. So yeah, this is the American value.
Did you find with the people you spoke
I
to?
just want to compare the like in California, like Los Angeles. There's another Asian American in that area, and the kind of American culture is not quite the same as Wyoming or Michigan.
Yeah. I did. Yeah. Sorry. I didn't have a chance to meet people in California, but people in Arizona, I didn't use them for my research because most of them are my family. Those I met, but they are a little bit different. Yes, there is some kind of difference for people living in Michigan and for people living in let's say Phoenix. If I want to compare it, because in Michigan they are clustered in one area, while in Arizona they are not clustered in one area, and there is no one specific area that's called all the Chaldeans or all the Iraqi Christians live here. While in Michigan, there's actually a lot of areas that you can say, well, these are Chaldeans, and their presence is significantly noticed. Yeah.
I think it would be good if you can make the local culture more expressive in your writing. Because when you begin, we are talking about space and place and the landscape, but it's all located in a certain place. So it's quite important to describe the Michigan and the suburb. And then there will be another very interesting contribution we have is the Iraqi people who stay in the place and how they conceptualize what is American culture and how they assimilate into their American culture. And there is sometimes very local, that's specific in certain areas. So somehow that space and place can be more expressive in the writing, and they kind of captures more, that more expressive. And that will be your contribution to see the conception of the Iraqi people and how they look at their surrounding areas.
Okay.
It's very interesting,
Yeah.
My question was going to kind of relate to that. In your gap between old and newcomers, do you see that difference in kind of that Americanness and American ideal? Because you talk about how the oldcomers kind of have created for themselves, lives. Or do they feel like they've experienced that kind of Americanness that you attribute? Like it's a reality for them?
Yeah, I could see that from the people I met, because I met people from they are actually in two different sides. They are more in north, the old comers, they are in the wealthier places, and their surroundings is more American, rather than this cluster of group that is on the east side that are all Chaldeans. Like you can find Middle Easterns in the neighborhood, but they go to the same church. Yeah. So there is this difference that I could easily witness, and they are more Americans, and that's why the old comers actually they joke about the newcomers, and there is the difference.
I know this was an issue that you talked about a lot with me, and not sure how best to ask you about this.
Mm-hmm.
But I know you were concerned about what I wrote down here, a sustainable diaspora community identity for Chaldean Americans. Something like having Chaldean Day. That's like the archetype of being a hyphenated American community. You know, the Irish have St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah.
The Italians have a day, and so on and so forth. And I know you talked about preservation of the culture and so on. Could you tell us a little bit about people who might be engaged in actively creating this kind of hyphenated, sustainable, again, I'm not sure it's the right term, but a sustainable diaspora hyphenated community?
The identity, you mean?
As an identity, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I mentioned, but I think I was not very clear. So it's either the Chaldean non-government organizations, or it is the church that's actually doing that.
So, but what are they doing?
Okay, so but they are not very successful. Both of them, they are having, because they know they want to keep the language, and language is very important to them, and they think that their identity is actually in the language. So they are trying to do this language. They are trying to create this atmosphere for people, to attract people. The language courses, activities that talk about history, that tell about the history of them being in Iraq. They bring let's say, when I was there, there was a 3-day course that I also participated. They brought a priest from Iraq that actually was in Mosul, and as the immigrants from Mosul, as the Iraqi Christians from Mosul were kicked out, they came to US, and now he met with his population in Michigan, with like his population that he was serving in Michigan. So that was some kind of bringing together all the people who share same ideas, same beliefs, same culture. That's one way to preserve it. But there was something that I noticed in these gatherings, was that the majority of population that are interested in this preserving the culture are the older ones, like the people who are older in age, because they were born in Iraq, they lived the majority of their life in Iraq, and then they came to US. US is something new for them. While the new generation, I guess I was the youngest person in that gathering, because they are not really interested in being there. They just want to enjoy being American or living in the American society. So that's one way the church is trying to do so. The non-government organization, because they are in US and they are trying to balance their services for the entire community, they cannot be racist and say, well, our service is only for Chaldeans or for Iraqi Christians. So this is something impossible to be. They cannot ever do. But they can name their society, their organization, an old Iraqi name. They can serve the people in order to keep the community together. But is it enough to attract everyone? That is the question, which I think is not enough.
Are they doing things for kids? You know, grandparents can bring their kids to things. Children can bring their kids. Parents. Anybody's a parent knows it's nice to have lots of activities, including cultural activities. They're doing things, and the kids don't have that much of a choice. Unlike the people who are in their 20s who are not going to come. The 10-year-olds are going to come because mom and dad or grandma and grandpa drag them. Yeah,
but that's also a struggle, because in US, I came across a lot of moms. I think a couple of moms I interviewed, and they said they have control over their kids until they go to school. When they start going to school, the school is different. Let's say we call it terbiya. Whatever they receive from the the teachings in school is different from the teachings at home. It's not about you can't talk to a girl, where you can't go out with a girl. In US and in the American society, this is normal. So these families, this is a struggle for the families. As long as the kids are in the house, they have control over them. I'm fine. I can I rule my house, but I cannot rule the outside. I cannot rule and impose my thoughts in the society. Maybe I can see that this is changing, but to an extent which is not very effective to the entire society. Like they have added Arabic programs to like Arabic language courses in schools in Michigan. Like one person, like let's say a teenager at high school, he can go to school and learn Arabic in school as one of his normal courses. But is it enough for him to feel that he's from Iraq? Is it enough for him to actually impact other surroundings? That's not enough.
I have a question that kind of goes back to what you discussed a little bit earlier, and that's kind of the notion of Americanness. I did want to bring in religion since that's sort of implicit, right?
Mm-hmm.
But do you think that some of the maybe more positive experiences in acculturation that you're describing are due to the fact that you're talking about Iraqi Christians as opposed to Iraqi Muslims, and that in some ways, like the U.S. presents itself as a Christian nation? Because when you talked about like the freedom and so on, I do think the U.S. is that like a lot of the racism and so on is also directed against people who are Muslims, right? So that I'm wondering if that's a way in kind of to be like because you're a minority in your own country, but then not so much in the U.S. I mean, in terms of there's sort of links to the Catholic Church, I guess, or kind of ways into.
So that's one thing that brings them more to the Americans, makes them be discriminated in Iraq,
Right.
and it also makes them to be discriminated also here in US. In Iraq, they were struggling because when the invasion happened, and still even before invasion, the Christians in Iraq were believed that they are secret agents of Western society. They are Westerners, whatever. They support the outside society rather than the Muslims who rule the country. So that's one kind of discrimination based on religion they receive. And then